Hello, everybody, and either welcome or welcome back to my podcast. As always, I'd like to remind everybody, if you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. So as I'm sure you can tell from the title of this episode, this is going to be a book review, specifically on the book How We Survived Communism and Even Laughed by Slavenka Drakulic. Now, this has been kind of in my to-do queue for a while now, and I went ahead and bumped it up because I want to go ahead and make this episode as kind of a preemptive counterpoint to a future book review episode that I will be doing. And that is that I'm sure everybody remembers that really stupid, dumb New York Times op-ed from earlier this year about how women have better sex under socialism. For some godforsaken reason that I will never understand, the woman who wrote that got a book deal. And now we are going to have an expanded version of that essay, which that essay didn't need to be written in the first place. I don't really need a book version of that, the bullshit idea that women had this like wonderful life under communism and that it was just this egalitarian utopia, because it was not. And that's why I want to go ahead and talk about this particular book right here. Now, to back it up and to kind of give you an idea of kind of the structure and format of this book, this isn't a big book. And when I say like a big book, I mean that both also, obviously physically, like it's not like 600-page doorstop, but it's not a big book like in the way like Gulag or Red Famine or 1989 or Gulag Archipelago or any of those are, where it's like this big overarching storyline of trying to explain everything that happened as far as the particular topic of that book. Like Gulag pretty much expands like the whole topic of the Gulag, and 1989 pretty much tells the whole story of the fall of the Soviet Union. But this book is not that. What this is she's got a collection of essays that she's written, and it's in book form here. So it's not like one long continuous story. It's a bunch of different essays on different topics that she has written about. And it's specifically, this book is meant to address the female experience under communism. And so a lot of the essays in this book deal with a lot of the issues that specifically women dealt with under communism. That's not to say that this is a book solely for women. Like, I recommend anybody read this because there is a lot of other material in here that gives you an idea of what life was like under Soviet rule. And something I want to go ahead and mention before we get too far into this is that Drakulic is Croatian. So she lived in Croatia, which was Yugoslavia before it was Croatia, but that's a whole nother ball of wax. But I say that to point out that she lived in a bloc country, like one of the Eastern Bloc countries. So the experiences that she has are a little different than the experiences that a woman living in Russia proper would have, I do think. In that a lot of the people that lived in bloc countries had a lot more freedom of movement. They could travel abroad. It wasn't considered weird. It was a different mentality and a different kind of mindset in the bloc countries versus living in Russia proper, where obviously you weren't really welcome to travel the world. I mean, unless you had like a ton of money, but even then people were like side-eyeing the hell out of you if you were in like a non-bloc country and you're from Russia and they're looking at you like, yeah. So it's a little different experience, but it is interesting to read when you understand that there were different experiences for different people under Soviet rule. So anyway, moving on to discuss the book a little bit. This was actually originally published back in 92. And so the time frame that it's dealing with is like right before 89, like right before the fall of Soviet Russia. And then a couple of years after that. Like there's one essay in here where she talks about the first actual real open vote held in Croatia after the fall of the Soviet Union, which that essay is just, oh my God, that's so great. But So that's the kind of time frame that we're dealing with, is like right there, like right at the end, like when everything was falling apart, and then the revolution happened, and then kind of a bit of the aftermath of what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union. Another interesting thing about the book itself is that when it first came out, and this is kind of a testimony to how far we've not come in the feminist movement, this book was actually a really, really big deal in feminist circles. It was considered the first real feminist critique of communism, because obviously it was coming from somebody who lived the life. Like, they were telling you, like, this is how bad it was under communism. And so contrast that to where we're at now, where we're having a book being published about how women's lives was just so fucking great under communism, and realize that, like, this was published in 92 and it's 2018. Like, it's not a huge amount of time. Like, what the hell happened to feminism that all of a sudden now there's like this pro-socialist strain of it? Like, did you guys forget your history? But yeah, like I said, this was a big deal in feminist circles, and even still today, this book is kind of a cult classic in certain circles. But I wish it was more widely known. I wish it was read the way that a lot of the bigger books are read, because personally, I like this kind of storytelling where it is like that intimate first person. You really get like that feeling of what it was like to be a woman in a communist country and having to deal with just like the day-to-day bullshit that you had to deal with. I mean, there's obviously always the big level issues, but it's that little day-to-day shit that gets you, that really grinds you down, that really makes you go from believing in communism as being this like wonderful, liberating, utopian thing to eventually calling it the big lie. So that's why I love her writing style. I love Drakulic's writing. I like it. I wish there were more books like this. If there are, please let me know. If there's other authors who write about their experiences under communism, like in this fashion, like this really like, not like super duper like technically detailed, but like this very like rich, deep way where if you read it, you kind of really, really get the vibe of what it was like. Like, I like this book. I like her writing. I've read Cafe Europa too, and I have The Balkan Express, but I'm a little scared to read that one. I'm afraid that that's going to be one of those ones where I'm going to need like a box of tissues somewhere near me when I read that one. But anyway, getting back to this book in particular. If there is anything you can take away from this book, is that men and women were not considered equals under communism. They were not. Women were kind of, in a way, second-class citizens under communism. As far as the state and central planning, like, not really giving a shit about women, honestly. Like, it was not this wonderful egalitarian utopia. Like, no, it sucked, actually, because as a woman under communism, you were expected to have a job, and you were expected to go work your 40 hours. But then after that, you were expected to go home and completely take care of home. Like, there was no shared responsibilities here. There was nobody helping you pick up the slack. I mean, even according to Karl Marx, when he was asked about doing things around the house, he very dismissively said, "That's women's work." And that was the attitude under communism towards, just taking care of house and home. So as a woman, you were expected to go work and then come home and do everything, all of it, the cooking, the cleaning, just child rearing and having children. That's a whole nother ball of wax right there. That was a very, very sensitive subject under communism, because under communism, abortion was not legal. And birth control wasn't really a thing either, because you were expected as a woman to have as many children as you possibly could, because obviously Mother Russia is going to need some more workers, so we got to start cranking out babies. So not only did you have this system where you had to work, you had to completely take care of home, you had no reproductive rights, really. Like, there was no birth control, you could not get an abortion, and even in certain countries, like obviously everybody knows about China and the one-child rule, but a lot of people don't talk about, especially in the Soviet countries, it was very much like monitored and you were being looked at. Like you were expected to have a certain amount of kids, and if you weren't, you were getting side-eyed. And that's not really a good thing under Soviet rule because people would be snitching on you. And if somebody snitched on you, and all of a sudden, like, yeah, bad things could possibly happen. And I bring that up because a lot of people, like I said, a lot of people talk about China. Nobody really ever talks about Romania. Now, that was the opposite of the one-child rule. You were expected in Romania, under Ceausescu's Romania, to have as many children as you possibly could, to the point where the state monitored your ovulation cycle. Yes, this wonderful egalitarian utopia where the state monitored your cycles to make sure you weren't cheating the state out of any babies. No, if this is your idea of a utopia, you can fucking keep it. Because it was not. There was no equality. I don't know where anybody got this idea that it was equal. Like, there's plenty of ways that you could know that this was not the case. Like, I don't even fucking... Anyway. And on the topic, obviously, of better sex under communism, like I already mentioned, there was no birth control. And there was, I will admit, a brief little moment in time right after the original Bolshevik Revolution where there was a little bit of sexual liberation and freedom for women, but that shit got locked down quick. Because all of a sudden, sex for pleasure became a bourgeois thing. So, and of course, you know, anything bourgeois had to be eliminated. So there was no sexual freedom for women. Like, there was no sex for pleasure. Like, you were expected, like, okay, if you're having sex, you should be making babies. Like, that was what was considered to be what you should be doing. And yeah, that was it. So I don't get this idea of better sex under communism. Like, it absolutely fucking was not. Like, oh my God, just so wrongheaded. Like, how do you not know the history of women's problems and tribulations under communism when anybody can know it? Like, I know it. I don't know. Anyway, let's move on to some of the more concrete examples from the book that I want to talk about, not only in the sphere of explaining to you what life was like for women, but what life was like for everybody under communism. Now, there are tons and tons and tons of stories and examples in this book, and I'm not going to go into everything, but the one that really struck me the most, and the one that kind of affected everybody, was the apartment situation. Now, if you're not aware of how things were under Soviet rule, obviously the state was responsible for making sure that you had a place to live, like you had a roof over your head. That was their job. So what would end up happening is, because building under Soviet rule, under central planning, was just a fucking dumpster fire. Like, there was so many problems. Like, this, I could do a whole episode on how and what happens, like, when workers are not incentivized to do their jobs in any kind of decent, timely fashion, and what happens when you leave people around construction supplies and they don't really give a shit about their employer, aka the state. So what happens to construction supplies under those circumstances? They don't end up where they're supposed to be, but they do end up in somebody's house. Just not the house that person happens to be building. But like I said, that's a whole nother story for another day. But under Soviet rule, you had to put people in houses. So what would happen is, because they couldn't build enough to house people, especially people coming in from the countryside coming into the city to work, what they would do is take the existing apartments that they had and just continuously chop them up into smaller and smaller and smaller apartments. So all of a sudden, like, an apartment that would house one family would be housing two families, and then three families, and then four families. And they would put up these little, like, flimsy walls to try to make new, like, small little apartments, but you still had to share, like, the kitchen and the bathroom and stuff like that, because they weren't building out new kitchens and bathrooms for all these little tiny apartments. But so just the idea that all of a sudden, like, your living space is just constantly getting cut into smaller and smaller pieces, and you're living with strangers, and you really have no privacy, because these little flimsy walls are like, you can hear everything that the other people are saying, and it just adds to that whole feeling of just no privacy. Like, everything that you say, everything you do, somebody can see you, somebody can hear you. Like, there's just no space of your own, and just even the space that you can carve out, it just gets chopped into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And it's like, oh my God, it's so claustrophobic to read that essay, because it's just like, your home is your home, and it's like, all of a sudden, like, your home just keeps getting chopped up into little pieces, and there's nothing you can do about it, because it's technically not your home. It's the state's home, and they can come do whatever the fuck they want to do. But it's just, I can't imagine living that way. But that's how people lived, and it's really wild to think about. Just the fact that you can come home one day and it's like, there's some strange people that, like, now live in your living room, because it's no longer your living room, it's their bedroom. Like, yeah. So that was just one that really, really struck me as being applicable to everybody, but especially to women. But going on to some of the stuff that was more women specific. And we'll start with some of the major stuff, and we'll move to some stuff that seems minor unless you are a woman and you really, like, understand what some of this stuff means. But we'll start with the one that is the most probably widely cited failure of central planning under the Soviet system, and that is the lack of feminine hygiene supplies. Now, if you were not aware of this, under Soviet rule and under central planning, the production of women's feminine supplies, tampons, pads, anything like that, wasn't considered important. Wasn't considered important enough to make. Just was not considered to be a thing that anybody needed to worry about. Which, I guess this is what happens when you have A, central planning, and B, a bunch of men doing the central planning. But it's like, what the fuck? Like, the most basic needs of women, like, just to have hygiene supplies. So, like, these women, and we're not talking like ye olden days, we're talking like the late 80s, were using menstrual rags and getting pieces of, like, cotton batting and sticking it in their underwear and just hoping for the best. And it's like, what a fucking failure. Like, how can you not provide, like, the most basic thing that half of your population needs? Like, how are you going to tell anybody that communism treated women and men equally and that it was egalitarian when women were using menstrual rags in the 80s because central planners were like, whatever, we don't need to make feminine hygiene supplies. That's not important. That's not a good use of resources. And it's just like, that, I think, is just the most indicative thing of how women were viewed under communism and under Soviet communism rule. Like, you were nothing. Like, you didn't matter. Like, your needs didn't matter. Like, who gives a shit? Like, okay, they'll figure it out. They'll make do somehow. And of course, if you are a woman, like, you know that unless you have, like, the correct feminine hygiene supplies, you can't really, like, leave the house or get too far away from a bathroom. Or, I mean, you kind of, it would definitely put your life on hold. So these women were having to, like, make do with, like, medieval remedies for their periods. And it's just like, come on. By that point, even second world countries were getting with it and making sure that women had feminine hygiene supplies. It's like, come on now, really? Really? But another example in that sort of vein that really shows how little central planners gave a shit about women in Soviet Russia. Washing machines. Like, if you had a washing machine, you were doing it. Like, you were big shit. Because, again, the central planners didn't really see why washing machines were all that important or necessary or helpful. So if you didn't have a washing machine, if you couldn't get your hands on a washing machine, because of course, obviously, because they were scarce, they did cost a bit of money if you could even get one because they weren't really being produced, you washed clothes by hand in a tub with a washboard. And it's like one of those all-day affairs. But again, it's just another example of how the central planners and the state really didn't give a shit about doing anything to make women's lives better or easier or just a nicer life. Like, no, now you've got to spend a whole day doing fucking laundry because we decided that making washing machines wasn't all that important. Like, who cares? Like, so what? It's just that attitude to like, okay, so it benefits women. Like, who cares? Who gives a shit? Another place the central planners really kind of fell down on the job is in providing any kind of selection as far as like makeup or hair dye or anything like that is concerned. Because again, central planners considered that bougie as bourgeois concern, so we don't really have to worry about it. But again, it's another example of something that would help a woman or make a woman's life easier being deemed irrelevant or just frivolous or bourgeois. And it's like, no, they really didn't care about women. And to try to explain this, because I'm sure a lot of you men are probably like, yeah, that is frivolous. Like, no, let me try to explain something to you. Because there is a specific name for this phenomena under capitalism, and it's called the lipstick index. What ends up happening when the economy starts going down, like things kind of go on a downslide, you'll see a kind of bit of a corresponding uptick in the sale of women's beauty supplies and makeup and hair dye and things like that. And the idea behind that is that when things are bad economically, you can at least, as a woman, you can buy a lipstick, or you can buy an eyeshadow, or you can buy hair dye, or you can buy whatever kind of beauty product, like some nail polish or something like that. And it's a cheap thrill. Like, it's something that's not expensive, but it is a little bit of a pick-me-up. And there is a psychological component to that. Like, it's, okay, so you can't go buy, like, the new bag or some new shoes or a new dress or anything like that, but you can go buy, like, a $10 lipstick. And then maybe if you put on the nice $10 lipstick, if you put on, like, a red lip, you do a nice makeup, like, you can at least kind of psych yourself up for the rest of your day, which is probably, especially by this point in communism, pretty shitty. But there is like that psychological component to makeup and hair dye and stuff like that for women. It's not just frivolous. It's not just bougie shit. It's the idea that, again, it's like cheap thrills. Like you can have something to try to make yourself feel a little better or a little more feminine, because that's another thing under communism. It really stripped away a lot of femininity from culture. And when I say that, it's like everything was utilitarian. Everything was just like square and flat and gray and just ugh. And there was no room for any kind of like beauty or expression or anything like that, at least the ways, especially for women, like through makeup and clothing and stuff like that, because it just wasn't made. So now you got stuck with whatever the central planners thought would make for good makeup and hair dye, which she points out in one of the essays, and I always still laugh about this to this day. There is a specific shade of red dye, and everybody who knows it calls it Warsaw Red, because it was the one hair dye that was widely available, and you would know it if you see it. It's that very bright, very garish red. Like, you'll still see sometimes like older Russian women with that hair color. And the reason why they all had it was because that was all there was. There was one color of hair dye. Like, there was maybe 3 colors of eyeshadow. There was one lipstick. And that shit matters. Like, it matters that you are providing something to try to help women feel better or happier about themselves or express their femininity. And obviously, under capitalism, companies are willing to make us as many lipsticks and blushes and eyeshadow palettes and hair dyes and whatever else that we are willing to buy. But under central planning, like, that was just not, it was considered just useless. Like, why would we bother wasting our time and money making that? Like, what good use is there for that? And I mean, I could sit here and go on for forever and ever on different examples from this book about how, yes, life under communism was shitty for everybody, but especially for women, it was just particularly shitty and difficult and just harder than it really needed to be because, again, nobody in central planning really gave a shit about making life easier or better or even, like, remotely workable for women. Like, nobody cared. It's just like, it's depressing to read in a way, but it is also a very important book to read, I think. And I do recommend this book to everybody. Like I said, I don't care what gender you are. Wherever you are on the 52 gender spectrum, go buy this book and read it. Like, it's just that good. And I love her writing style. I know I said it before, but it's so great. It's so immersive, and you really get to know what life was like under communism, and even what you internalize under communism, like what it does to your mind. And even once you're not in that situation anymore, even once the revolution happened, the 89 revolution, and she talks about how she did end up moving to New York and spending some time there, but trying to process, like, New York City through the lens of somebody who's lived under communism. It's really touching, and it's really just, it's just a great example of what communism really does to you mentally, like how it changes your mindset and the way you process things. And so I'm going to go ahead on that note and wrap this up because this has already gone a little longer than I planned. But yes, like I said, great book. Please go read it. Try to read it before you read the other stupid, dumb book. But yeah, I will be doing a review on that later. I have it coming, so I will read it. I will review it for you guys. But for now, let's just go ahead and wrap this up. If you did like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. Take care, and until next time.